All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation from the League of Women Voters Austin area. My name is Jessica Foreman, and I'm the Austin Area League's Director of Advocacy. We first off want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us to find out what is on the ballot. Some of our partner organizations had asked for a recording on this topic to share with folks, but I always think a presentation goes a little bit better if there's at least some live audience. So I'm glad that we have you joining us today to make this recording a little bit more interactive. This is going to end up on our YouTube channel afterwards. So if you want to reference anything we're going to talk about, you will be able to do that as well. I hope that you'll be interactive as a part of this presentation, so post your questions in the Q&A feature. If you want to share something with the group as a whole, you can place that in the chat. I don't have a moderator today, but I will periodically be checking the chat and Q&A for any questions that pop up. Again, this session is being recorded and will go up on our YouTube channel. So here is another welcome to those folks that are going to be viewing this in the future. Okay, today we're going to be talking about the races and propositions that will be on your ballot, not the specific candidates. The League is a nonpartisan organization and doesn't endorse parties or persons running for office. So instead of telling you today, for example, who to vote for district judge, I want to talk about what topics and what things you should be looking at when you decide who to vote for. A companion then to this presentation is going to be the League's Voters Guide, where we're going to ask the folks running for positions to answer questions about these hot topics in their own words. If you go to our website, which is listed here, you'll see the Voters Guide front and center. I encourage you to download a copy of it for some afternoon reading before you head out to vote today or next week. And additionally, keep in mind that you can't take your phone in when you vote, but you can take a printed copy of the voter's guide. And guess what? You're probably going to need it because it is a long ballot this year. And there is no straight ticket voting. So we're encouraging everyone to research and vote all the way down to the bottom of the ballot. Normally, when we talk about what's on your ballot, we start at the top, the Senate race, and we kind of work our way down through state races and local races. But I wanted to turn that process on its head a little bit. Instead of going by state, then county, then city, in this presentation, I have grouped races by their powers and duties rather than what entity or area they represent. I've tried to illustrate that on screen a little bit. So we're going to kind of think of this as three different pots. We are going to have our policymakers, and these are the folks that write the law, set the tax rates, and set the budget for whatever entity they represent, be it the US Senate and the entire US, or it could be the state of Texas with our state reps and state senators, the county with our county commissioners, or the city council with the city. The second group we're grouping together is everyone involved in criminal and civil justice. And these folks are going to interpret the law, conduct trials, or in the case of law enforcement, investigate crimes. And the third group I'm calling our public administrators. And these are folks that they get law from policymakers and then they have to implement it by making rules and policies. They oversee big offices and they manage large budgets. So in each of these pots, as we go along, we're going to talk about what you want to think about when you're voting for each of these groups. So we'll circle back to these ideas as we go through. There are some big themes you're going to see that matter for every single race on the ballot. COVID has caused there to be quite a crunch on resources. Every single level of government is not getting the same tax revenue they normally do, and so cuts are going to have to be made. Your priorities, what you think should not be cut or should be cut, you're going to want to pay attention to that when you vote. It's not news to most of you probably that it's a pretty politically toxic place out there right now. So folks are going to have to make tough decisions and be able to stand up to that pressure. You want people that have good management skills, that can manage budgets, that can manage staff. And finally, for all races, in my opinion, the most important thing is you want people that have integrity, that are ethical, and that have a good demeanor to represent us as government officials. So the first group we're going to look at are policymakers. And these are folks, again, that set the budget for whatever entity they represent. They set the tax rate and they write laws. So what do you want to look at when you're thinking about who to vote for those policymakers? What are your priorities? If you're extremely passionate about the environment, maybe you want new laws written surrounding that. You want to make sure that doesn't get cut in the budget. If transportation is really something you're interested in, then that's your priority, and you want to see how that matches the folks that are running. Where you want your money spent and where you don't want it spent, and how you want that money raised. Do you want a property tax increase, or do you think a property tax increase is worth it at the local level? Do you want maybe taxes raised on certain people or certain entities at the national level, but not others? And does this policymaker have a good demeanor and is an ethical person because they're representing you in this office? So ones that you're probably all familiar with are national and state policymakers. There is a US Senate seat that is up. Everyone that represents Texas as a US representative is up for election because those are 2-year terms. At the state level, a good deal of folks are up for Texas state senator, about half of the chamber's seats, and one of the state Senate spots is up in Travis County. So you want to check out the voter guide to see if you fit in that state Senate race. And these are 4-year long terms. And Texas state representative, everyone is up here because, again, these are 2-year terms, so they run every 2 years. What are some of the issues? Well, in our voters guide, what we have asked the US Senate candidates are questions about immigration, healthcare, gun violence, voting rights, and COVID-19. So if you go to the voters guide, you can see their answers to those questions. Similar things for the US representative: voting rights, COVID-19, criminal justice reform, and what's their highest priority going into session. State and senator races have the same question. What's their opinion on doing fair redistricting? Everyone who's elected this time at the state level will participate in redistricting or redrawing our state voting districts. And in the past, there's been a lot of accusations of gerrymandering, or in other words, drawing the districts in a certain way to benefit a certain party or person. So you can go to our voters guide and see what people are saying about how they want to fairly redraw the districts. COVID-19 obviously is going to be a question for any policymaker. What are they going to do with limited funds? What are they going to do for the economic condition COVID has put us in? Criminal justice reform, are they going to change any state laws due to that? And what is their highest priority going into the session? So that is our national and state policymakers. But we also have a policymaker at the county level, and several of these positions are up as well. This is a county commissioner. They are basically the policymaker for the county. They are going to set the county budget, and that includes county law enforcement like sheriffs and constables, the health budget, EMT, fire department budget, and set the county tax rate. They're also going to do a lot of planning for roads and bridges, water, flooding, fire planning, land use and zoning outside of the city of Austin, but within Travis County or Williamson County, and environmental laws. The question that we've asked these policymakers in the voters guide are, how do they feel about criminal justice reform? So again, why are we asking the county commissioners about that? Because they hold the purse strings for the money. So if you support things like, say, diversion programs, which are programs that allow people with some convictions to divert from prison or jail and instead to go through a program targeted at, say, treatment for alcohol abuse, that costs money, and the county commissioners have to set a budget for it. We're having a big conversation about funding law enforcement. So if you think county law enforcement like sheriffs and constables should have their budget cut, if you think they should have it increased, the county commissioners are going to be the folks that decide that. And transportation, taking care of roads and bridges, is a major commissioner duty, and they're going to talk about it in the voters guide. So head over to that and check out what they're saying their priorities are. So we'll get a little bit smaller, and now city council functions as the policymaker for the city. And this could be whatever city you live in. So Austin, or maybe you live in Cedar Park or Manor. Many different municipalities are going to have city council folks up for election. They're going to do similar things to the county, but it's going to be the city budget, the city tax rate, and city planning that they're going to do. We asked a question and the voters got a little different here about transparency. How are you as a council member going to engage with community groups? We think this gets even more important the more local you go. Are you listening to your constituents, even in COVID-19, where you can't come testify in person? What different things are you putting in place to make your office transparent? Police reform, the city council sets the budget for the city police. So county for sheriffs and constables, and city for city police. So again, your opinion on police budgets, whether that is increasing or decreasing, you want to see what the person you're voting for council believes on that too. City infrastructure. Every single city in Central Texas is growing by leaps and bounds. So what is their vision for how that infrastructure is going to increase? Those are all the kind of things we're going to focus on in the voter's guide. So those are our policymakers that are going to be on your ballot. Before we move into our next pot of criminal and civil justice, let me check the questions. So question here, do the commissioners have any control over this defund the police issue? Yes and no. So they don't have any control over the funding for the city police. That will all be the city council. But commissioners do set the budget for the sheriff and for each constable. So we haven't heard as much in the news about those budgets, but they do set that, and that kind of flies under the radar a little bit. So not the city police, but yes, for some law enforcement agencies. So our next pot we're kind of talking about is criminal and civil justice, okay? This is going to be our law enforcement entities, our county and district attorneys, and our judges. And what do you want to look for when you're voting for these folks? Do they have a good demeanor and are they ethical? This is even more important than your policymakers. You've got to have a high standard for your law enforcement, for your judges, for your county and district attorneys. What's your opinion on criminal justice reform? Do you want to see less people sentenced to prison and instead sentenced to prison alternatives? How do you feel about the prosecution of low-level drug cases, for example? So you have to kind of think of what you're passionate about, what your position is, and that will help you decide who to vote for. And finally, what's the background for this? For policymakers, lots of people can become policymakers. If you have a background in education or transportation or in the environment, then you can bring some really interesting stuff to the table as a policymaker. But when you're thinking about criminal and civil justice, you sometimes need a more specific background. Some of it is required. For certain judicial positions and county and district attorney, you have to be an attorney. For law enforcement, like what's your background as a law enforcement officer? So you kind of want to take a deeper dive into this, and that will help you decide who you want to vote on. So for our law enforcement races that are going to be on the ballot, we will have the sheriff and the constable. First thing before we dip into this, I want to talk about what's the difference in a sheriff, in a constable, and in a city police. And there's two main differences. One is that sheriffs and constables are elected, they're elected officials, and city police, they're an appointed position that the city manager or city council appoints, depending on the type of local government you have. So in Austin, the city manager appoints the chief of police. But the sheriff and constable are elected officials. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second is that they all control different jurisdictions. And what a jurisdiction, what that word means is areas that they have power over. So sheriff, their jurisdiction is the whole county. A constable is a precinct in the county. Travis County has 5 constable precincts. Williamson County has 4. So they only have jurisdiction over each of those precincts. And city police only have jurisdiction over the city. Now, what happens when the city of Austin is also in Travis County and is also in a constable precinct? Who has control over what? Well, in this case, these law enforcement entities sign memorandums of understanding with each other and say, well, we're going to police this issue and you police that issue. So for example, say you're in North Austin and Travis County, the city police say, well, we are going to investigate crime or break-ins. But Travis County, you're going to deal with illegal dumping or some kind of environmental law. So they kind of make these agreements with each other saying, I'll work on this topic and you work on this topic. So again, the sheriff has the jurisdiction for the full county. And one important thing they're going to do is they're going to manage the county jail. And you may think, who's in the county jail? Who's in the state prison system? Good question. So if you've been convicted of a felony, you're generally going to be in the state prison system. But if you've been convicted of a misdemeanor, or you haven't been convicted of anything and you're waiting for trial, you're going to be in the county jail, and the sheriff is going to manage that county jail. The Sheriff's Department also provides security for courts as bailiffing and making sure that there's no court security incidents. And they're going to serve civil papers and warrants. Civil papers are documents that are orders from the court, say, for example, telling you that you've been sued or that you need to come to court for a particular reason. The constable is going to have some overlap in these duties. They're divided into precincts. And they're going to focus a lot less on criminal law, although they do traffic citations or certain things in areas. But they're going to focus a lot more on serving those civil papers and warrants for the court. And they're specifically going to bailiff for the Justice of the Peace Court as well, whereas the sheriff is going to bailiff for the higher levels of court. So what are some of the things you want to keep in mind as the hot topics for these races? Well, specifically in Travis County, there is a question in our voter's guide about the women's jail. So certain folks have said we need a separate jail for women. It's too crowded. We need to provide some extra resources. And other people say, no, the expense isn't worth it. So you kind of want to check out what the candidates are saying there. You also want to know what the person running for office is going to do to decrease officer-involved shootings. Are they going to make sure there's more training involved? What are they going to do to stop this hugely important issue that's coming up? We didn't receive any responses from the candidates for sheriff in Williamson County, but some things to keep in mind for that race are generally the same for all these races, except the women's jail is a particular issue only for Travis County. For Wilco, a specific issue you might look for is the sheriff's office relationship with media and social media. If you want to do a quick Google search, you can read some articles on kind of the arguments surrounding that. So we also want to take a look at district and county attorney. So each county is going to have a county attorney and a district attorney on their ballot. So what's the difference? Well, the district attorney is going to prosecute felonies, and the county attorney is going to prosecute misdemeanors and also represent the county in civil suits and provide legal advice to elected officials in the county. So we're at a very interesting place nationally in the conversation surrounding prosecution. If you took a time machine back to 1990, you'd hear most prosecutors across the US say, lock up the criminals and throw away the key kind of attitude. But our opinion on prosecution is undergoing a change. We want to make sure we're prosecuting the right crimes and the right people, not just representing the state of Texas, also getting justice for the victims, but also having a duty toward the defendant to investigate and make sure there's enough evidence that points to prosecution. Where you're going to hear about this the most is, should we prosecute low-level amounts of marijuana cases? And that's been a big argument back and forth in some of the district and county attorney races that you can read about in the voter's guide. You want your district attorney and county attorney to really be respected in the community. So what are they going to do to promote confidence in their ability? Do they have an idea for imprisonment alternatives? We normally think about sentencing when we vote for judges, but prosecutors play a really integral role in that they're going to ask for certain sentences during a trial. And if they support diversion programs or sending folks to different alternatives for prison, then that's more likely to happen in our system. So you can read about the county attorney in Travis County is unopposed, but the district attorney questions in Travis and county in Wilco will be in there as well. Now we get to judicial races. I feel like this is the area that most people ask questions about and are a little unsure about how to choose to vote. I agree, it is hard to figure out how to vote for these folks. So before we get started, I want to give you 3 tips that I think can be helpful to think about when you're voting for judges. First, don't vote, or you want your judges to not be overtly political. They do have to run under a party affiliation, but they should always be fair and impartial. And that's even in their public life outside the courtroom. One thing is judges are not allowed to endorse other candidates for office because that makes them seem overly political. So you want somebody that seems fair and impartial as possible. The second thing, you want a judge's background to kind of match the bench that they are running for. So for example, if someone is running for a family law court that's going to hear divorce cases, then maybe you want to see that they have some experience in that arena of law before they become a judge. And third, what is your opinion on criminal justice reform? Do you think we should have shorter prison sentences? Do you think folks who show up to court without attorneys should have more access? So you have to kind of think in this national conversation we're having about criminal justice reform, how you feel, and then find some candidates that match that. There's 2 different types of courts. There's a lot of different courts you're going to vote on. So trying to think of some way to break it up that would make a little more sense. So there's 2 major categories. The first are trial court judges. And these are kind of what we think about like Judge Judy, or if you're watching Law and Order. And these are basically judges that will hear trials, jury trials or bench trials, and a case will get started in their court. Okay, so they're going to be, in many cases, the first ones hearing that case. Then we have appellate court judges. There are not any cases that start in the appellate courts. Instead, these are all cases that have been appealed from the trial courts up to the appellate court section. They're going to look at the law, they're going to research other cases that have been decided, and then make a recommendation based on that case that comes up. So they're not going to deal with the public as much. When it gets to the appellate level, it's mostly going to be attorneys arguing different case law there. But the decision they make in these appellate courts can become binding law for the area that they represent. So it can become policy after that. So if we want to start with trial courts, I have put all the different trial courts that you might see up here, but only 2 groups of these are going to be on the ballot, of county courts at law and district courts. So what are the differences in those? Well, district courts are going to hear certain types of cases, divorce, child custody hearings, civil cases or contract disputes more than $200,000. So say a restaurant is suing a real estate company, or there's a lawsuit against a hospital, medical malpractice. Torts cases, this could be like I'm in a car accident, I'm suing the person that hit me, or certain other kinds. And there's also felony criminal cases, okay? So this can be anything from drug cases up to capital murder cases. District courts are gonna hear. County courts at law are going to hear misdemeanors, class A and B misdemeanors. And this can range anywhere from certain types of DUI cases to domestic family violence to mental health commitment cases. And they'll also hear some civil cases below 200,000. So different levels of the law. So what are the issues concerning here that you want to keep in mind? Well, what types of experience does the person running have that would make them suitable for this bench? And we asked them that question in the voter's guide, so you can check that out. What is their opinion on sentencing in criminal courts? Do they support alternatives to imprisonment? And what do we mean by that? Diversion programs, alternatives to imprisonment. Let's say someone gets a DUI. You can serve jail time for that, but there could also be a diversion program that would instead make you take alcohol awareness classes, make you have a breathalyzer in your car for a certain amount of time. So in other words, different things you have to meet besides going to prison. And this is a really hot topic. And so you want to see if they support diversion programs and alternatives to imprisonment. Self-represented litigants. These are folks who go to court without attorneys, which is their right in many of these cases. Do the judges make it easy for them, help explain the system without providing legal advice? These are big courts, big dockets. Do they have good organization and management skills? And most importantly, what is their demeanor? Are they calm? Are they judicial? Do they listen to everyone? Do they seem fair at all times? So these are the issues with our trial courts. With the appellate courts, what kind of things did we ask in the voters guide? Well, for the Supreme Court, so basically we have several courts of appeals all over the state, and then those get appealed up to two co-equal courts at the top. Court of Criminal Appeals, which will hear everything to do with criminal cases, and the Supreme Court, which has everything to do with civil. In the voters guide, what we ask the Supreme Court folks running for office is what is their opinion on how judges are elected? Right now, as you know, judges are elected by party affiliation. They run under Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Independent Party. But there's a lot of movement in the state to change that and actually make judges elected, but not by party affiliation. Now, the Supreme Court can't enact that law, but they oftentimes are heavily involved in setting the tone for the judiciary in Texas. So their opinion on this topic can affect the recommendations that might then go to the legislature. So check out what our candidates running for that say if you think judicial selection should change. Appeals courts can have rulings that affect their policy and affect the area that they manage. So you want to look at what their priorities are and what their position is on criminal justice reform. For the Court of Criminal Appeals, we ask questions on mental health and access to justice and the indigent defense system. So how are we protecting folks and making sure they have due process and their rights when these other issues are at play? Let's see if we have any questions here. Do any local courts deal with immigration issues? That I am not sure about. I know we have a few attorneys on the chat here. So if anybody does know the answer to that and you want to pop that into the chat for me, I can read it out when we get to our next question and answer part. Okay, so now we're moving on to this third group or third pot of elected officials, and I'm calling them the public administrators. They are going to be agencies and boards. They don't pass law, but once the law is passed, it comes to them and they have to implement the law. So even though they're not writing law, they are writing rules and procedures and regulations that can affect our lives in similar ways to how laws do. They're also generally overseeing huge offices or huge jurisdictions with a lot of different staff members and really big budgets. So you want them to be a good manager that knows how to manage money and knows how to manage staff. Also, when they're writing these regulations, these policies and procedures, you want them to match your priorities on this issue. And what's their experience? You know, generally you want them to have a deep knowledge of the area that they're running for. And finally, again, as is everything, you want them to have a good demeanor and be ethical. So one of these public administrators you're voting for at the state level is the Texas Railroad Commissioner, which has nothing to do with railroads. So why in the world does it have that name? Well, this commission used to manage railroads until the 80s when managing railroads became a federal issue. So they kept the name, but what they actually do is regulate the oil and gas industry. And that's going to include pipeline safety, gas utilities, safety and liquefied petroleum gas, and mining. So they're kind of a regulatory commission. Each commissioner has a 6-year term, and there are 3 commissioners that serve overlapping terms. So we're voting for one of those 3 commissioners on there. And you want to check out the questions we're asking them in the voter's guide about the regulation of the oil and gas industry. Another one that many of you, although not all, may be voting on is a member for your area of the State Board of Education. This is 15 members on a board, and they serve 4-year terms. Not all of them are up this year, so you'll have to check your ballot to see if you're in an area that has one up. And what are they going to do? They decide curriculum standards, student testing, special ed programs, and textbooks for Texas public schools. 2 important things that come up in the news a lot for this group of folks is that they're going to revise education standards, and this tends to be a highly controversial area. The most recent education standards they've been revising are the sexual education standards, and there have been a lot of very public kind of battles over this. So if you're curious about where the person you're voting for stands, you might do a little Google search to catch yourself up on that topic. Additionally, the State Board of Education is going to approve or not approve charter schools. So your opinion on charter schools, whether you think there should be more or there should be fewer charter schools, you want to check out what the person you're voting for agrees on that. And that's a tricky one because folks don't necessarily vote down party lines on charter schools. You know, with a lot of policymakers, you can have in your head, oh, okay, well, Democrats usually think this way, libertarians this way. But with charter schools, it seems to be all over the map. We have some Democrats that are for and against, some Republicans that are for and against. So you need to do a little more research on this topic if it's something that's important to you. Now that's the State Board of Education. There's also a lot of local school board races up, many different ones in the Williamson and Travis County area. So what are some of the things you want to consider when voting for a local school board? Maybe you are intimately familiar with their decisions if you have children, and COVID-19, the school board has decided to do in-person versus online learning, and your opinion on that. School funding is a huge issue. Funding is going to decrease for these folks. So what are they going to cut? How are they going to manage that? What does your school board believe on police reform? This may seem like an odd one to ask, but there is a big role for law enforcement, such as school resource officers in the school system. And this has been a really hot topic. Some folks saying we don't need school resource officers in schools, and some saying we need more. So you kind of want to see what the person you're voting on thinks on that topic. And we also ask a question in the voter's guide about discipline. There's lots of changing opinions regarding disciplinary best practices and equity in discipline. For example, that discipline is being offered the same for students of all colors and not fixated on, for example, expelling more students of color than white students. So you want to see what school board members are saying about that topic as well. Another public administrator we have is the county tax assessor collector. This entity represents the whole county and collects taxes and fees for state and local agencies. I just want to give a little bit of props to the county tax assessor. They do not set the tax rate. That is the commissioners. They only collect it. Okay, so they're not doing that. We don't want to blame that on them. They also register people to vote, which of course at the league is we think a very important position because of that. They're also going to be responsible for vehicle registration, titles. Oftentimes they collect court costs, fines, and fees for the county courts. So what are the issues here? Well, you want somebody that's a really good manager because there's a lot of stuff going on here, a lot of staff. You want good customer service and a lot of efficiency if you're having to deal with this agency. And also, cybersecurity is a really big issue. A lot of local governments have been hit with different kinds of malware that have locked up their offices and their different computer programs. So you want someone running for this position that's kind of on the up and up for cybersecurity best practices. And finally, do they do a good job at voter registration efforts? The league cares about this topic very much, so that's something you want to look into as well. Okay, I don't see any questions yet. So we'll move on. So these are all the different positions. Now, there may be more positions on your ballot. There are mud races, municipal utility district races, different water boards, all kinds of things, but those break down too specific really for us to include. So do check your ballot before you go, because you might have an election you weren't aware of that's going to show up on there. For everybody that's on, these next two things, we're going to talk about the City of Austin propositions. So everything we've talked up to until now has kind of affected everybody that lives anywhere in Central Texas. But the City of Austin propositions A and B are only going to affect you if you live and pay taxes in the City of Austin. So let's talk about Prop A first. A question I've gotten a lot is, how do I know if this is on my ballot? Again, we have a lot of mud districts and a lot of things that can be kind of confusing to know whether or not you vote on this. So do you pay City of Austin taxes? If you do, then this will be on your ballot. If you pay mud taxes instead of City of Austin taxes, then it will not be on your ballot. So that's kind of what depends on that. Prop A is often called Project Connect, okay? And I want to give a little background about how Prop A got on the ballot because it's kind of been a multiple year process. So for several decades, efforts have been underway to propose some kind of passenger rail or dedicated mass transit option. In the past 3 years, the City of Austin and CapMetro have coordinated with each other and have come up with a mobility planning project. In other words, a really big project they've worked on together that touches all kinds of different transportation needs for the City of Austin. On June 10th, the Project Connect System Plan, which is what this plan is called, was adopted by both CapMetro and the Austin City Council. Then, so this is the whole big plan. And then they came back on July 27th and took a portion of this plan, which they're calling the initial investment, and decided to put it on the ballot. So a couple of things to know. Where did this come from? The City Council and CapMetro. Proposition A only covers the initial investment, not the entire plan. So keep that in mind. Once this plan, if it passes, the city and CapMetro also approved the creation of an independent board that's going to oversee this plan. The independent board is going to include a city council member, a CapMetro board member, along with 3 citizens. And the citizens need to have different types of expertise, including financial, engineering, construction, and community planning. The last thing that happened is there were some concerns. Obviously, this is a huge investment going through. And so the city created a contract with the voters. And this was created to memorialize policy guidance on construction impact, affordable housing, worker protection, and local business participation. And if you go to Project Connect's website, you can download this contract with the voters, and it'll go over the assurances of what the city is saying it will do as a part of this board if Project Connect is passed. Okay. So Project Connect is a $7.1 billion proposition. And what is actually included on it? We're going to go through some of the big picture details. 2 light rails and 1 commuter rail line spanning 27 miles of service and having 31 stations. So what's the difference in light rail and commuter rail? Light rail systems are passenger trains powered by overhead electrical wires, while commuter rail systems operate on existing freight train tracks. Light rail systems typically require a new set of tracks. So overhead, or kind of what we generally think of train lines with commuter rails. So there's going to be 3 lines that are added. And the first one, the orange line, is going to operate as a light rail and run from North Austin to South Austin. It's basically going to start at North Lamar and 183, run down Lamar, then Guadalupe, heading by the University of Texas and the Capitol. And then south of the river, it's going to switch over to South Congress and end at Stastny. I have some photos here of where the line is, but the best thing I would recommend is to go to Project Connect's website so you can download a big picture of the maps of all the lines. It's easier to see that way. The second line that's going to propose as part of Prop A is the blue line. And this is going to be a light rail line that's going to run similar and parallel to the orange line until it gets to Republic Square downtown. And then it's going to cut east and run near the convention center and then south of the river on Riverside out to the airport. The third line that's going to be built as a part of Prop A is the green line. This is commuter rail, okay, so it's going to use existing freight lines, and it's going to connect East Austin to downtown on an existing CapMetro rail line. It's going to serve neighborhoods like Colony Park, the Eastern Crescent, the East 183 area, Springdale, Pleasant Valley, Plaza Saltillo, and then downtown eventually as well. It's not just rail lines with Proposition A, it's actually also a large expanded bus system. 9 new park and rides in 1 transit center, 4 new Metro Rapid routes and 3 Metro Express routes, and 15 new neighborhood circulators. What's a circulator? A circulator is an on-demand pickup and drop-off location. Basically, it provides service to the last mile or first mile of connections. So it could be like a bus that's just kind of running in a loop to get you to a train station or different things like that. I really encourage you to check out the map because it does show where all the bus routes are going to be, where all the neighborhood circulators are, and everything in one picture that can make it a little easier to understand. What else is going to be in the proposition? The red line is the current line we have in Austin, and it's going to include a new station, which is going to be at the soccer stadium and also serve the Domain up north. As a part of this, they're also going to build a downtown transit tunnel. They think this will make the train lines go faster and also will decrease the effect it's going to have on car traffic downtown as well. An all-electric bike fleet stationed at transit hubs. It includes money in there for maintenance improvements, which will be a continual cost. And new customer technology systems. Basically, they're going to integrate everything into the CapMetro app. So there's money in the proposition to be able to do that as well. So that's a lot of stuff promised in this proposition, which sounds great. Well, let's talk money. So probably everybody on this call has gotten a lot of information mailed to you, emailed to you about this from folks supporting for both people for this proposition and against it. And there's been some misinformation out there about the financing portion of it. So kind of want to go into a little detail here. This is not a bond election. This is a property tax increase. So what's the difference? A bond election is kind of like a mortgage for your house. You're going to take out loans at a certain interest rate and pay them back. And then, maybe you'll pay them back over 15 years or over 30 years, but you'll have to also pay interest on them. But this is not a bond election. We are actually voting to increase property taxes. This is important because the property tax increase is going to be permanent. But also because a lot of the folks that are coming out against Project Connect are saying, well, what happens when the bond money runs out? We're going to have to vote on another bond. But that's not the case because this is not a bond election. Instead, the money is not going to run out because this is a permanent property tax increase. That doesn't mean they would never need more money, but it does mean if they wanted to increase the property tax again, it would have to go to a vote for all of us as well. So how much is this going to increase my property taxes? There has been a lot of misinformation put out about this. So I want to show you what the average taxpayer in Austin pays. Now, not everybody in Austin is an AISD, so this isn't going to be an exact one for everyone on this call, but this is an estimate. So a lot of the things people have been saying is that it's going to increase your property tax by 25%. It is true that it is going to increase your City of Austin property tax by approximately 25%. But as you can see by this diagram, the City of Austin taxes is just one of the smaller components of your overall taxes. And so it seems like there's been some misinformation where folks are saying it's going to increase your property taxes by 25% overall. That is not true. It's going to be about 4% overall, but it is 25% of that little city of Austin block. So when you see a lot of that information coming out, you want to read the fine print. Yes, 25% of your city of Austin taxes estimated, but no, that does not mean 25% of your entire tax load that you pay. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the, I'm calling them discussion points, basically stuff that folks have been arguing over. So discussion point one, this $7.1 billion proposition assumes that the city of Austin is going to receive 45% of that $7.1 billion in investment costs from federal grants from the US government. So the US government gives certain kind of infrastructure and transportation grants to cities, like the city puts up some money and the federal government puts up some money. So one of the big points of contention are groups opposing Project Connect are saying that it's unlikely that the city is going to be able to receive 45% of funding through federal grants because of COVID and falling tax revenues. And in that case, taxpayers are going to be on the hook for the full $7.1 billion. That's what opponents are saying. Supporters, though, are saying that 45% is actually a conservative estimate and that we may even receive more federal grants than 45%. They base that on just President Trump's tenure. So what should you know about that? What's the truth? Well, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Some administrations, and we're talking about presidential administrations, spend a lot more on infrastructure than others. Both candidates running for president, both Trump and Biden, have made comments about increasing transportation funding, which means maybe in that case, we could increase the number of local grants we get. Does that mean we absolutely will, though? Who knows, right? We don't even know who's going to win the election at this point. But it does seem that under some administrations, like President Reagan's, for example, projects were funded up to 80%. So 45% does seem like a conservative estimate. Of course, we've never had COVID before, so that certainly complicates things. But let's say for whatever reason, they didn't get 45% or they got more. What's going to happen? I actually called CapMetro and met with them and asked what would happen if they received more or less funding than 45% from the federal government. They told me basically it would either speed up the timeline if they receive more money or slow down the timeline if they receive less. But they absolutely cannot increase the tax rate without another vote. So that can't be something they can sneak in there. So say they end up getting 70% federal grants, maybe our timeline for completion goes from 7 years to 5 years. If they only receive 35%, maybe it goes from 7 years to 10 years. So it's really messing with the timeline there. But important thing to note, they can't just increase taxes. That's against the law. They would have to take it to another vote. Okay, discussion point 2, is this plan actually going to decrease traffic in the city? So supporters of Project Connect say, yes, absolutely. We're going to get more cars off the street and more folks in public transportation options, which will decrease traffic. Opponents of the plan, though, say no. Guess what? Ridership on rail is falling in other cities, and the city would be better positioned to focus on new types of mobility instead of train lines. And some examples some of these groups give are infrastructure for shared mobility. This is basically infrastructure for things like Uber and Lyft. Maybe something similar to what you see at the Austin airport, where you walk out and you can catch a ride share. And to focus more on autonomous vehicles, which they think are going to be something more forward thinking than rail. What's the answer to that? That is beyond my job description. So you might want to do some research if you yourself are interested in thinking about that discussion point. Discussion point 3, is Project Connect equitable? In other words, does this serve all the different folks in Austin? So opponents say that Project Connect focuses on expanding services in the form of RedLine for wealthier and wider suburban commuters, instead of focusing on folks who need public transportation the most: people of color, people living on the east side, and people with disabilities. Opponents also reference a 2015 CapMetro study that found that 70% of rail riders were white, compared to only 36% of bus riders. So in other words, this plan focuses too much money on wealthier and whiter communities and not enough on people of color. Additionally, opponents are concerned that the rising property values around new train lines might accelerate gentrification and the displacement of low-income and middle-income Black and Hispanic families. So that's the arguments against Project Connect. On this topic, proponents of Project Connect say that the city set aside $300 million specifically for anti-displacement strategies. What does that mean, anti-displacement strategies? I called CapMetro and spoke to them and asked them what that means. It can mean kind of a toolkit, a range of things. Buying land that you could then build affordable housing on, and we're talking about the city buying land. Down payment assistance, rental assistance for folks whose property values rose too quickly around the new train lines, repair budgets, money to keep cultural sites in place and to help some businesses, and basically to look at each neighborhood and see how can we make the best change for the folks that are living there. I asked who gets to decide which strategy we use on which neighborhood if Project Connect passes. And the answer is the city council. They would be the deciders on which of these strategies they would use in which area of Austin. And finally, discussion point 4. This is the crux of the matter. Anytime you're voting on propositions or bonds or funding is money and priorities. This is the heart of the matter. Groups opposing this say we shouldn't increase taxes right now. This focuses too much on rail and instead should focus on different kinds of transportation needs. People supporting it saying we have to make traffic mitigation strategies now. It takes a long time to come up with these plans. So we're going to keep pushing the barrel down the road, so to speak. And this is a comprehensive plan that serves many different areas of the city. So kind of thinking about it, if you're more for the status quo of how traffic works, of how public transportation works, of how our property tax are set currently, then you would want to not vote for Proposition A. But if you want rail lines, more transportation options, the kind that are listed in this proposition, and you're okay with an approximately 4% increase in property taxes, then you would want to vote for Prop A. So all of that very wonkish, very in-depth discussion basically comes down to, do you think this plan is good enough for the money? Yes, vote for it. No, don't. There is another proposition on the ballot that hasn't gotten nearly the amount of attention of Prop A, so we want to make sure you're aware that there's also a City of Austin Prop B. So let's talk a little bit about this. In the last 5 years, Austin has allocated money through bond elections for active transportation. What does that mean? Active, walking, bike lanes, trails, sidewalks. So not cars, not buses, but active transportation. The money set aside for these projects in 2018 and 2016 bond elections is going to be gone by 2024, leaving current projects unfinished and new projects without any funding. So this summer, local mobility advocates requested that there be a $750 million safe mobility bond added to the ballot in order to fund these gaps. So they asked for $750 million. The city council voted to drop that down to $450 million. So you're actually voting for a $450 million bond on this issue when you go to the polls. The money is going to be spent to fund gaps that these other bonds did not pay for, including specifically $80 million for sidewalks, urban trails, bike lanes, safety improvements, safe routes to schools. So these are areas around schools where they're making walking safer, transit enhancements, street improvements, and large capital projects. Two of the more expensive things that are going to be a part of this are a pair of bridges spanning Lady Bird Lake on the upper side of Longhorn Dam at Pleasant Valley, along with proposed improvements to the Barton Springs Road Bridge over Barton Creek. So really allowing more pedestrian and bicyclists safer access to Zilker Park and the Barton Springs pool. Okay, let's talk money. This is a bond election. So Prop A is a property tax increase. Prop B is a bond election. It means we're going to take out loans essentially and pay them back. How much is that going to cost you? Well, for a homeowner that's in our median sales price, so say your home is worth about $415,000, this is going to be about $83 more a year for you. So if your home's worth less than that, say you're a renter, well, guess what? You're still going to see some money because of that, because the person that owns the complex you live in, their property tax are going to go up and they're going to pass that along to you. It's just a lot harder to give you a number when it works like that. There have not been a lot of conversations in the news about for or against Prop B, but it kind of goes back to the same thing we were talking about with Prop A, money and priorities. Do you think the cost to you and to the taxpayer is worth what you're getting for this active mobility network? If you do, then vote yes on Prop B, and if you do not, then vote no. What else? There are some other bonds and different things that we're not going to cover today, but will be in the voter's guide. Pflugerville has 3 bonds up. Lago Vista ISD. There are city charter amendments. These are basically little law changes to the city charter, which is like a constitution for the city, in Round Rock, Taylor, and Lakeway. Those are all in the voter's guide though, so if you're in one of those areas, you can research that. Not in the voter's guide are mud, water districts, smaller bonds, and propositions. Unfortunately, there's just too many of those for us to be able to provide that in the voter's guide. But you might want to look up your ballot to see if you can find some local information on that as well. Well, we just hit 2 minutes till the hour, and I want to thank everybody for sharing your lunch break with us. That was a lot of information. The ballot is long, but highly important, and I know we get a little bit into the weeds on the transportation bond. I do want to tell you that if you have more specific questions, I know a lot of folks on this call maybe are very well informed about transportation and know a lot more about the topic than me. There is an email address that is, let me see if I can pull it up here. Basically, Project Connect, the folks over there at CapMetro told me that if you email them a question, they are required by law to answer you in writing. So if you have a very technical question, please don't ask it to me, but we do want you to find out that information. So I'm going to pop that in the chat, and it's feedback@projectconnect.com. So again, let's see here, find our chat. I'm going to send that out to everyone here. So say you have a detailed question about the transit tunnel or about the funding mechanisms or about how you get to be on the independent board of the displacement strategies. I do, Project Connect said, please email us. And I'm sure they're getting slammed with a lot of questions right now, so you might need to give them several business days to get back, but they will provide you an answer, which I think can be very helpful if you're really curious about a particular area that we covered and want more detail. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to stay on the line for a little bit longer. I'm going to stop our recording. And if anybody has any questions they would like to ask, you won't be recorded for this part. And so if there's an answer I can provide you, I'll be happy to do that. Again, thank you so much for coming. And thank you for those folks who are watching on our YouTube channel, and happy voting in these next few weeks.